So, good morning, everyone. Welcome to another Aruba Post Corona Zoom series here at the University of Aruba, hosted by the Center for Lifelong Learning. And my name is Deborah Alexander, and I'm the coordinator for the Center for Lifelong Learning. We have another interesting topic today, and with the previous session, I just want to remind everyone to be aware of the Zoom webinar features, which are, as on our next slide, we will see. So you need to take note that you're not the only one in this Zoom webinar. You might just see myself and the presenter, but there are many others who are logging in with you at the moment. And just for that, I think it would be nice if you use the chat box at the bottom to send us a note and let us know who you are and where you're looking in from or to which company you work. This is a moment to send a shout out. I would also like for you to use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, specifically for those questions that you have for the presenter. These will be answered at the end of the webinar. So during the process, during her presentation, just start jotting down any questions that you might have, and also feel free to do that in the language that is most comfortable for you, and we will make sure that it is answered. Internet still always remains a problem. It's unpredictable, but it has been improving. So should myself or the presenter or yourself fall out, just have patience, click on the link, rejoin, and if not, wait until we come back. You just have nowhere else to go. And last but not least, at the end of the webinar, once you click your browser, a pop-up will appear asking you to fill in our evaluation form. We really encourage you and appreciate your feedback, because through this we can better improve our presentations to you in the upcoming future. So today is topic 11 from the Aruba Post Corona series. As you all remembered, is based on the Donut Economic Framework, which has been designed by Kay Raworth. And today's topic is gender inequality in Aruba and beyond. What will change after COVID-19? And who's talking about this? Well, she is a person who has given many presentations at the university for the Center for Lifelong Learning, and she is no other than Jen Ross. Jen is a part-time lecturer at the University of Aruba. She teaches at the Faculty of Arts and Science in the Department of Social Work and Development. She holds a bachelor's in journalism, a master's in political studies, and a master's in international relations. All these her education then formed the basis for her current job, which she now is a consultant and has been a staff member with the UN Women, the UN Office of the High Commissioners for Human Rights, and the UN Economic Commissions for Latin America and the Caribbean. Without further ado, Jen, I would like for you to talk to us about gender inequality.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Deborah. And thanks for the invitation. I think this is a great opportunity to kind of really think through this moment that took us all by surprise. Obviously, coronavirus changed many things, changed the way we live. And there are some areas that haven't really been thought through that well. And I wanted to really dig into one of the areas that I've done a lot of work on, which is on gender equality. And gender inequality, which is the status quo at the moment, unfortunately, and what really kind of thinking about this moment, because it's really an opportunity as well. It's not just looking at the negative side, but seeing the opportunity we have to hit the reset button, and what can we change in light of this sort of earth-stopping moment. So, as I begin, I wanted to quickly touch on what do we mean by gender equality, because I think definitions are always important to have here. So at the very basic level, gender equality has to do with the concept or you can also call it the goal, of achieving equality in a number of areas, in rights, in responsibilities, and in opportunities, so that the outcomes can be more equal for both women and men, because currently, as we know, those are not equal. Gender equality also has to do with making sure that both sexes have the potential to really shape their own destinies, their own lives, and contribute to society in all areas. So these are some of the general definitions that have been, that are used, and I just wanted to put those out there as we begin. So any discussion about gender equality has to look at what the situation was, right? I think data is really important and powerful and gives us a snapshot of what we're talking about here. So globally, gender inequalities before COVID were as such. Women spent 3 times more than men on unpaid care and domestic work. That, in many countries, it's much higher than that, but this is globally an average. Laws also in many countries prevented women from occupying specific types of jobs. For example, in 104 countries, and in 18 of those countries, women actually need to get permission from their husbands in order to work at all. There's a wage gap as well. Women earned 77 cents for every dollar earned by men, and that's for equal work. So we're not talking about in different jobs, they're doing the lower end of the salary. For equal jobs, women have been earning consistently less than men in every society. Women are also more likely to be informally employed, which means they don't have contracts. And many of the social protections that in countries that don't have the types of protection like Aruba does, for example, women are much more unprotected. They don't have access to unemployment insurance, etc., even health insurance in many countries if you're informally employed without a contract. So that is more vulnerable kinds of employment. Women are also much less likely to work in general, not necessarily because they don't want to, but because of a number of barriers. So you look at the global snapshot, we know there is unemployment around the world, but of working aged men, 76% are employed around the world, and just under 50% of women are employed. So there's a big gap there. We're looking at, 3 in 4 men and 2 in 4 women. But the importance of this cannot be understated. Having more women employed is absolutely essential to countries being able to flourish and grow economically. Those doing best off have the highest rates of women's participation in the workforce. And they've actually studied this, like they've done over the recent years modeling in economics, and they've said, okay, if we actually were to have women play an identical role to men in the labor market, how would that change our economies? And what research has found is that the boost to global annual gross domestic product, so GDP, would be $28 trillion if that were the case. So getting more women into the workforce is actually a very important part of economic growth. Also, more pre-COVID global gender inequalities. When you look at the leadership level, women have always also been very underrepresented. And if you look at parliamentarians around the world, only a quarter, 25% around the world were women as of March 2020. Women also occupied a fraction, only 29% of senior corporate management roles in 2019. If you look at Fortune 500 companies, the number is even less, 5%. But also, when you look at which women are getting the top level jobs, we also see that intersecting types of inequality play a big role. So women who have a disability, women who are from ethnic minorities, LGBT women, any woman who has any multiple or compounding types of inequalities faces less opportunity. For example, Latina women only occupied 6.2% of those management roles. White women were the vast majority. Black women, 3.8%, and Asian women, 2.4%. So you can see that the numbers, in addition to being highly against women, are also much against women from different groups and ethnic minorities. Globally, women were more likely than men and boys to be poor. We know this across the world. You can see this in terms of those making less than the global minimum wage or the global poverty line of $1.90 a day. Women and girls were more likely than men and boys to go hungry in nearly 2/3 of countries. And girls were more likely than boys to be left out of school. You have to remember that in many countries where education is private and paid, and they don't have strong public health system or public education systems, for example, if parents have a very low income and they have to choose one of their children, if they have a boy and a girl, they will send the boy to school in almost all of the cases, leaving the girl at home to do the housework and the chores. And so this is one of the situations that exists globally, 15 million versus 10 million girls versus boys out of school. And COVID-19 is expected to exacerbate all the vulnerabilities that I've just talked about. Also, when you look at devices and during this pandemic, if you've got one tablet at home and one child who can do online schooling, it's often been the boys who've been given that priority. Health and social indicators are also really important. If you look at the staggering statistics, 1 in 3 women around the world have experienced physical or sexual violence. And globally, women make up 70% of healthcare workers, predominantly in the nursing area. But obviously, women who are in the healthcare sector predominantly are much more exposed on the front lines of contracting the virus in this situation. Media and stereotypes. It's not just the economics and the leadership and in the certain professions and violence, but women are also much less likely to appear in movies, for example. They've done studies on this. And as we know, the majority, so actually 79% of directors of films are men. And when they've looked at a study of 120 popular films, they found that 31% of speaking roles were women, and only 23% of feature film protagonists were women. So this kind of discrimination filters into all types of areas where we see in popular culture women are disadvantaged. This happens a lot in just daily usage. There's a lot of discrimination, sexist jokes, songs, memes. I'm sure you've received some of the type that you see on the screen. I mean, these stereotypical gender roles abound and they get normalized. And they really make people think it's just funny. And it's interesting because there's been a lot of progression. It is no longer politically acceptable or politically correct to make racist jokes, to make homophobic jokes. But at the same time, there's the double standard because sexist jokes seem to be open game. Now, when we look at COVID-19 and its impacts for women, there has also been a clear change, and many of the factors I've already stressed have gotten worse. When you look at gender-based violence, the lockdowns in many parts of the world and stay-at-home orders have meant that women and girls were stuck at home with their abusers, or even men who weren't abusive before, by the mere fact of being stressed about their income, about the fact that they couldn't leave the house. It left people more exposed, and it has led to an increase in domestic violence. 30% is actually the increased average that NGOs, police forces, different agencies are reporting in many countries. In Colombia, helpline calls actually jumped 91% after the COVID stay-at-home order. So, and that's even in a context where making these calls can be risky because your abuser could even hear you making the phone call. Interestingly enough, in Argentina, when we just look at the very month of March, that month, 29 people in Argentina died from coronavirus. At the same time, another 27 women were killed by violent male partners. It's a phenomenon called femicide, and that has been rampant across much of the region and the world. And this really puts into perspective the fact that you don't hear a lot of people talking about or the fear about femicide, yet when you look at the death rate, it's actually, in some cases, comes quite close. The gendered impacts of COVID-19 on unpaid care and domestic work are also obvious. Many people who've had to stay home have seen that everyone who's staying at home, the workload has multiplied just by the sheer fact of having more people at home for a longer period of time, in many cases not being able to go to restaurants, so there's more food to prepare, more work to do, more cleanliness involved. And the studies have estimated that women who've answered studies about this have reported that their workload has doubled during the pandemic. Now, importantly, men have also been doing more chores during this situation and doing more care work at home. In fact, according to a New York Times poll, 20% of men in the US said that they were either fully or mostly responsible for unpaid care during lockdown, which is great. That's a very encouraging, number. Although interestingly, at the same time, when they surveyed these same men, they talked to their wives or their partners at the same time, only 2% of their women partners agreed with them. So it's not necessarily that perception is 100% accurate in many cases. One of the ways that we've been measuring around the world, or that different organizations have been measuring the impact of COVID-19 on women, has been through something called a rapid gender assessment survey. So this can be done either through phone calls or online surveys, but I wanted to showcase a few of the interesting findings there. In all countries, as we mentioned with gender-based violence, women were more likely to report either experiencing or hearing about increased domestic violence. And also troubling was that most women, more than 50%, did not know where to go or what to do, who to call in those cases. In fact, more men than women who were taking these surveys knew about services that were available. And also, when you look at European and Central Asian countries, in 7 out of the 10 surveyed, women reported having a greater difficulty paying for basic expenses than men. In 4 out of 10 countries, women were more likely to report having trouble accessing food than men. And in 4 out of 10 women who were in need of family planning services like birth control, etc., reported major difficulties in being able to access health and reproductive services. Now, what about Aruba? Obviously, most of this data that I've been looking at has been global. And to be honest, there is little data available, but there have been some surveys and some research on the situation for women in the context of COVID-19. One is a survey by the University of Aruba's own Clementia Eugene, she presented this actually in a Zoom meeting through the Center for Lifelong Learning a few weeks ago now, and said, for example, interestingly, her research found that women were much more likely than men to report feeling stressed as a result of the pandemic and COVID-19, the whole situation. At the same time, she also found that women were more likely to be resilient. So they have better coping techniques for this and being able to channel their stress in more productive ways. In terms of the impact on the population too, there was a recent report by the government's gender task force. This is the task force put together to create a gender policy for Aruba. And it put together a study quickly on the impact of COVID-19 and the feminization of COVID-19 in Aruba, and found that if you look at just the number of jobs out there in the formal economy in Aruba, they found that 69.4% of the jobs that were in the formal economy that are occupied by women are considered at risk. So the vast majority of those jobs who were more likely to be lost or to have reduced working hours, primarily in tourism sector, as we know, most of those are occupied by women. When we look also at some of the statistics on violence, this is not a systematically gathered area. So the little information we have in Aruba are cases that have been reported to Fundación Gente Mujer en Dificultad. And the statistics are both pre and post-COVID. The period is from January to April 2020, in which there were 126 violence against women cases. Interestingly, 71% of those were foreigners, were women who were not born in Aruba, which again brings us back to the point of intersectionality. Obviously, certain women have a much greater vulnerability, whether they're documented or undocumented. They're certainly facing higher rates of gender-based violence. And it will be interesting to see if those statistics change in the context or over time. Also, when you look at client registration, the Department of Social Affairs in Aruba, they had most of their aid is provided to female-headed households, almost 90% actually, so it's quite high. And of those, 2/3, so 65.6% were women with a disability. Also, again, emphasizing intersectionalities and women who are more vulnerable or at risk in this context. Also, of course, we know that with the increased use, on unpaid childcare, on unpaid housework, women have been carrying the disproportionate burden in Aruba, as in most countries. This reflects a number of factors. Cultural expectations are a big one. And in Aruba, there's a lot of shaming that goes around for women who don't fulfill these, stereotypes and expectations. You may have heard of the mamaka la cuna, saying or stereotype, which is, just shows you the reinforcement of those popular attitudes and conceptions and how they can shape and further exacerbate gender inequality, because you don't have equivalents like that for men. Some key recommendations from the report that came out are basically that any response to COVID-19 should be grounded in strong gender policy objectives. The report recommends the government may need to introduce flexible working hours for family members who are assuming the caregiving role. Government may need to consider measuring unpaid care work and remunerating it. Now you notice I've bolded that because that's actually a very bold assertion. The government remunerating on what is currently now unpaid care work is an incredibly important finding I found of this report, because it's practically revolutionary in a country where you can see that there is already a high social spending. But to actually do this would be a profound transformation. To be remunerating unpaid care work would actually also do a lot to spur the economy. And we'll get back to that when we look at donut economics. But financial support and guidance for women on how to negotiate gender equality in caregiving and minimize their stress. So how do you sit down and talk to your spouse about getting them to play a more equal role? Also, it mentions considering the impact on migrant women, documented or not, because they do face fewer job opportunities and are more at risk of what we've looked at in terms of poverty and violence. Other recommendations I would like to add to the list are the kind that UN Women and many organizations have been making in this context. And that is that when we talked about leadership, women need to be involved in decision-making about COVID-19 responses. Because if they're left out of the table, they're not going to have their needs reflected in the measures that governments take. So they really have to be fairly represented and have equal participation in these decision-making bodies. We also need to ensure that women have some of the basic necessities, of course, like food and health, particularly for the elderly who have a harder time with mobility, etc. And healthcare is part of that. Women's healthcare has been neglected for many because of the crisis. Services that normally functioned had to be, shut down. And so especially with reproductive health and even things like getting a mammogram done, this can have serious health consequences in the long term. But there are ways of getting around this through things like ad hoc and mobile clinics that can fill the gap in access to medical services. Shelters and hotlines must be funded and widely publicized. This is something that is not the case in Aruba and in many countries where there isn't a strong public funding and awareness campaigns, etc., so that people know where to go, as we've seen in some of the data that's come out. We also need sex disaggregated and gender sensitive data to gauge the impact. If you don't know and you can't understand the situation on the ground, you won't be able to craft proper policies and responses. So in this sense, it's really important to include two specific types of surveys that are often left out of general surveys. Those are surveys on gender-based violence and on time use on unpaid care, because they're very specific things that require a certain set of questions and even skills in terms of doing the interviews. Now, with all of this said, where do we go from here? I do, as I mentioned, see COVID-19 as an opportunity to hit that reset button, as a moment of awakening in a sense, because on the one hand, people have become more aware of the increased burden that women have shouldered just by the sheer fact of seeing it on a daily basis. And it's important to put this in the context of the donut economic framework that we've been adopting throughout the Zoom series. As you can see in the center of the donut, gender equality is one of those social foundations, really, for the rest of the whole framework. Being able to have a system that is more based on well-being, on people's development, rather than profit-making. Essentially, the whole COVID crisis has, I think, profoundly shaken and has led us to question, and we need to question, a lot of the economic and political models and structures that have brought us here. Capitalism itself is essentially flawed, and it is essentially a pyramid scheme that has only led the rich to get richer in this situation and the poor to be more vulnerable. It's also important to, and part of the donut framework on the outside of the donut is living within the means of the planet. So we need to choose greener and more sustainable forms of ensuring livelihoods, and that means that we have to keep things within a certain level. Also for Aruba, it's really important to question, and as we've seen, the reliance on tourism, which is profoundly exploitative by nature and unsustainable as the sole or main pillar of the economy. Also important is to rethink a lot of the social, health, and education models that have been followed, and to really invest in a care economy. As we know, women are primarily drawn to jobs in the care economy sector, in education and health. And so increasing investment in these areas would also provide more opportunities for women's employment and more stable or less vulnerable types of employment. obviously COVID-19 has meant that we need to invest more in healthcare so that the population is more protected, which includes jobs, and also in education with the new need for social distancing, etc. Instead of having schools functioning 2 days a week, etc., and having teachers teach, half of the class on alternate days, why don't we hire twice as many teachers? And then you would both meet the requirements for smaller class size and for increasing the quality of education being provided to children across the board. This would obviously require a big investment, but it's not an investment. And I use the word investment purposely because it is an investment. It is not just spending. It is something that will bring continued returns. If you think about this in the model of the whole care economy, it's really important to just erase some of the preconceptions and think about this as an opportunity to start anew. What would doing this mean? What would reorienting ourselves as a care economy mean for the society and how it works, not just for women, for women, men, children, for everyone in general. And also part of that was the investing in unpaid care work as well. Fundamentally, another area, when I talked about stereotypes and so forth, we can't achieve a lot of this without really rethinking and bringing about more awareness and challenging the pervasive cultural and systemic social inequalities. And that's not just in gender. I'm talking about all types of intersecting inequalities. And this moment has brought about an awakening in many areas. And I'm so encouraged to see, for example, the Black Lives Movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, the Child Lives Matter in Aruba also. These protest movements reflect an awakening. They show that there is, despite even in some cases, the risks of bringing this forward in countries that have higher rates to protest is actually dangerous in the context of COVID. But the fact that people are willing to stand their ground and stand up and, call attention to these systemic inequalities. And the only way to get rid of a systemic inequality is to change that system, right? We have to challenge that. We have to make people more aware of it and make it not politically correct to make sexist jokes, etc., because gender inequality is just one more type of these many inequalities. And so it's important to give it the attention that it is due and to, think through how we can bring more attention to that and get rid of some of the harmful stereotypes that perpetuate it. So I wanted to leave you on a thought for how do we move forward. And I like this meme. It's one that has many of you may have seen on Facebook or whatnot, but it's really that historically pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. This one is no different. It is a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. We can choose to walk through it, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice and hatred, our avarice, our data banks and dead ideas, our dead rivers and smoky skies behind us. Or we can walk through lightly with little luggage, ready to imagine another world and ready to fight for it. So I encourage you all to do the same. And since we're talking about fresh ideas, I would welcome you also to throw a few of your own into the hat. So, any fresh ideas? Let me know what you think.
Thank you, Jen, for the very interesting conversation. It was straight to the point, and it definitely had me thinking, what do I think about gender equality here on Aruba? I think many of the things you highlighted, we kind of knew, but it shines a different perspective. I would like to go over now to the Q&A section of this presentation, and I see that we have some of it already. A question, very, very relevant one, and one that's very important for Aruba. How has having a female prime minister impacted the awareness and improvement of gender inequality? Good question.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a number of ways of looking at that. First of all, the survey, for example, the report I mentioned on the feminization of COVID-19, that wouldn't have been available if it weren't for it was put out by the Prime Minister's office and the gender task force that she created to create a gender policy for Aruba. We haven't seen, Aruba doesn't have a gender policy yet. No previous Prime Minister has made that a priority. And so it's interesting that because I'm obviously politically neutral, I don't have any political affiliations. And for me, it was interesting as a political scientist during the elections when the Prime Minister was, campaigning and so forth. I thought, oh, it's sort of disappointing. She's not talking about gender and she's not really talking about women's rights or anything to that effect. So I was like, okay, it's great that we're going to have a female prime minister, but I mean, she's not really talking about gender. And it did take her a little bit of time, but I think even just before COVID, she really started in that direction. And I think she was just making sure she had a solid grounding for the government before getting into some of maybe the trickier topics for Aruba. But I think that leadership and the way that she has handled the COVID crisis has been exemplary. I mean, I think she did everything right, shutting down early, the response is being very transparent with, these press conferences twice a day. Many countries have not had that type of response. And so being available, that's been very important. And I think if you look at some of the memes, actually, I don't have it on my slide, but I'm sure some of you have seen these memes about what countries are doing better when it comes to the coronavirus and which countries are doing worse. And the photos of their leaders, they're all the women countries, New Zealand, Germany, like they all of the Nordics, Aruba, countries with the lowest infection rates and who've had the best responses, also in terms of being able to give their people who are adversely affected financial support. That's been a really important part of this, like giving Arubans who lost their jobs support. So that's been great. And all the countries that have the highest rates of infection and the worst responses had male leaders. So I think that says it right there.
Yeah, totally. And I have the list as well, indeed. You said, indeed, Germany, Finland, New Zealand, Iceland, Taiwan, Denmark, Norway. They were just at the top of doing successfully. And I think it's time that men start taking our role seriously, because I think we definitely bring something different to the table, and which goes then to the question, what really lies at the root of gender inequality? What do you think it is? What lies at the root?
I do think that power struggles and power structures have lied at the root of it. I mean, power imbalances are the root of politics around the world too. If you have a male and woman relationship, there's always like this struggle for who has the say and who has power, right? That's behind a lot of gender-based violence. It's just trying to subdue women. But also, if you look at it in every area, in employment, who has the most power and the hot top jobs, it's always men, or predominantly men, if you look at the statistics that I've shown. In leadership roles, etc. It's a structural, struggle for power, and I think that gender inequality. Ooh, am I logged off?
No, you're still there.
Okay, sorry, my video went, so I was like, where did you go? Anyhow, I think that power lies at the root of it, and I don't think that. And I think that often the things that I've mentioned, like stereotypes and all those are ways that are used to try to justify or, even make light of something by making it seem normal and socially ingrained.
Yeah. So you mentioned the word, indeed. It's interesting that we in Aruba don't have a word like Mama Kalakuna for shaming fathers who, don't take care of their children and responsibilities for caring for them. And the question is, we find that acceptable? Is it acceptable then that we don't have a word, or we should have a word? I don't know.
I don't think we should have a word for shaming anyone who doesn't fit any preconceived social notion of, I just think it's unfair that it's only applied to women. I don't think shaming is okay in any case. So I wouldn't condone having one for men. It's just that it's unfair that it's only applied to women, because it implies that it is okay for men to do that. That it's okay for men to take the backseat role and be on their phones all day, or be absent completely, as we know is the case in many households. And so that's not okay.
Okay. To what extent do you think that women in Aruba accept the objectifying of women in this culture?
I think that women do this a lot. Unfortunately, women accept it. They perform it themselves. Objectifying women, I mean, I don't want to make fun of it. I don't use fake nails and all those things, but I think that there's a very important emphasis on women's appearance in Aruba, right? I don't know if it's part of the carnival culture or whatnot, but having the nails and the hair and the whole, like, women have to look a certain way, and women themselves perpetuate that stereotype rather than, and you hear a lot of criticisms. Oh, she didn't do that. She doesn't. Oh, look what she's wearing, and that undermines other women instead of boosting them up for what they're doing right, or the volunteering that they're doing, filling boxes at Fundaciones Comunidad on the weekend, or helping with the neighbors' kids who don't have anything to eat, or so forth. I mean, those are the sorts of things and the positive messages that women need to be reinforcing. But unfortunately, you hear a lot of gossip, and that's not just in Aruba, that's in every country. Women, rather than supporting each other and propping them up, unfortunately, have a tendency in some places to break them down, and often for trivial things. But so I think objectification happens with both the physical look or expectations that we dress or look a sexy certain way. The objectification of the female body in that way is quite prevalent in a lot of countries in the Caribbean, Central America, etc. That's one of the arguments that they make in Muslim countries for using the burqa and so forth. It's like, wait a minute, this is a way of reducing or, making women less a focus of or an object, right? And there is some truth to that argument in terms of the fact that there's just too much emphasis on physical attributes rather than, mental and abilities.
Yeah, and you actually answered a question that was posed, which is, do you think women take other women seriously? Not really, I think, if I can read between the lines.
Well, I mean, it depends. Some of them do, some of them don't. I mean, and it would be interesting. I don't think, and we wouldn't be able to track it, but for example, in the US with Donald Trump, who is obviously a misogynist, sexist, like he was guilty of,
many things,
sexual assault, and people knew about this during his election campaign. Yet he had a great number of women who were supporting him, which I found just mind-boggling. But it would be interesting to see how many women, for example, supported or voted for Evelyn in Aruba. I mean, we would never get statistics like that because obviously who you vote for is private. But I think that it's important for her to show her abilities, because maybe people mistrust the idea of a woman because they've never seen it. It's just a fear of the unknown, which is behind a lot of racism itself and other types of discrimination. Like, they're not going to do a good job because, they've never had that opportunity. So having the opportunity to show your worth and show what you're capable of, I think is really important in changing those attitudes.
Yeah, and that ties another question is, how willing do you think women in Aruba are to fight for gender equality?
Now there, I don't see very much willingness, unfortunately. As you know, I also teach part-time. And so I think in general, Arubans have tended not to be very willing to fight for things. I think, when I ask people, for example, in classes, have you ever been to a protest before? Almost always the answer is no. I mean, it's not something that's really been in the culture here to do. That's why it was very interesting to see, for example, the Child Lives Matter protest a few weeks ago. I was like, wow, there's a number of people who've come out. I mean, the only protest I'd seen before that was against the sugar tax, which I thought was crazy. I mean, people don't protest about, all sorts of social inequalities, and they're protesting against a sugar tax that's supposed to protect your health. I mean, that was indicative to me of the level of acceptance of a number of these things.
And it's actually
changing.
Yeah, and as you said, I mean, even with Black Lives Matter, I know there were 2 events, and you did see an ethnically diverse group present, but the numbers were still very small, and we don't have a protesting mindset or will. But I think it's time that changed, because I think equality, and you see it now also with the discussion in seeking funds from the Netherlands. These are moments that we have to, COVID brought many change. And I think one of the things is fighting for rights, whether we agree or disagree, but we as a nation do need to, step it up a bit more if we would like to head into the direction where we think we all can have an equal and safe life, and where everyone is prospering, just to say that. Why do you think that, why do women believe that they must buy into the objectification of themselves? Is it just being conditioned into it, or lack of awareness?
I think it's both. I think that we are conditioned. Obviously, we're all social beings. We are all profoundly shaped by certain expectations. You want to fit in. Nobody wants to be the weird one that people talk about, right? There's something about like the psychology of wanting to be accepted. So, people will, and also in many cases, the fear of not finding a partner. If I don't look a certain way, maybe I won't be attractive to the other sex. And so there's a whole psychological part of that, which, plays into being and wanting to be accepted, but also just more awareness about objectification or about gender equality is also lacking. I mean, it's not something that's sort of general knowledge in many places, even in more in societies that have, for example, I mean, I was raised in Canada, and there's much more sort of general consciousness about feminism and about gender equality there, but that's not all for the whole population either. It's only certain segments of the population who kind of hear those messages. So awareness is really difficult anywhere to come about, but you can only do it by events like this, where you're raising people's knowledge. But then again, it's like you're almost preaching to the converted, because I'm guessing that most of the people who tuned in today already have a belief that this is important or necessary, and it's really getting to the people who don't care at all that is the hard part.
Yeah, and that's the thing. As you say, there's the group that log in. We are aware, we're interested, and hopefully I always try with the knowledge that I've gained to make it available through conversations with others, because I know they're not all logging into the Center for Lifelong Learning to look at these webinars, but I make sure to inform them, well, I saw a presentation on this and this, and have you thought of that? And actually now I'm thinking, and it's also a question, what would it actually take then for us to wake women up to their own worth as human beings? I mean, we do it through conversations, but what do you think it will take?
What do I think it will take? That is a good question. I mean, there are a lot of ways to do this, and most of the successful ways that have done this has been very individual, right? So programs that work with women to, for example, increase their economic empowerment, and in the process they take workshops and so forth, because they're forced to, as a condition of, say, doing this Cash for Work program. I mean, that's what a lot of UN Women's programming around the world has been. It's like trying to increase women's awareness and then empowerment and leadership opportunities and so forth. I think a lot of what works well it takes time, it takes investment, it takes working with people directly, because at the same time there are also maybe public service announcements actually in some countries have worked quite well. You know, I don't really see a lot of public service announcements in Aruba, and I think even some of the commercials that when I do, which I must admit is not that often, but when I do watch Aruban television, I'm like, you know, I mean, you look at those Satar commercials of the guy looking at the girl doing exercises out the window or whatever. I mean, a lot of those commercials themselves are ultimately they're kind of really sexist, and so I don't know, maybe some media training and awareness, because there is not a media, a professional media in Aruba. Say, or no journalism program, or at least very few, if any, journalism graduates, perhaps if they've done it abroad and come back, who work in Aruban media. Most people have just learned on the job, and they haven't gone through media sensitization or awareness training. So that's an area that's also really important when you talk about the stereotypes and mass messaging, or even just the ability to place a PSA on something like that, or who would produce it. You know, I mean, those are important opportunities for changing the switch of the general public who might not have access to, you know, specialized training or might not need it.
Yeah, and I totally agree as where concerns media. I mean, there was a bit of a rumble with one of the larger companies that had a commercial that did not add up. And I think just being aware that people, and I mean, I applaud those who, include myself, who spoke out about it. But I sometimes say when you see yourself reflected in the commercials, it's not in the most pleasant way. And I'm speaking then in terms of color. So you feel that you're not represented correctly, but also in looking at many commercials, I'm curious how many people notice the ethnic composition or race compositions of the commercials that are made, that sometimes it does not adequately reflect our community that we live in. So those are things where I think we should become more aware of, and where definitely the media plays a role in how women, but also groups within our community are.
You hardly ever see a disabled person. It's like they don't exist in the media.
And that's one of the things that I think we should change, because as president of the board for the Foundation of the Mentally Disabled, I don't see our clients even reflected. And some might say it's sensitive, yes or no, but I think we should be aware that if we're speaking about an all-inclusive island and community, inclusiveness does mean accepting those that we do not see. But let's continue with the questions, because there are others that are coming. You kind of touched base already with one where it says, to what extent will the change of digital payment versus cash affect the situation? Many women in Aruba in basic work get paid via cash, and they do not contribute to tax and social services. They are not registered in the employment status statistics. So that plays a role in gender equality again, you know, equal form of pay. So maybe you can shed light on that.
Right. I mean, some of this has to do with formal employment as well. Like if you're getting paid cash, you're probably not formally employed. But also you have to remember, a lot of women don't even have bank accounts around the world. Like the amount of women who have access to their own financial means and control is also quite low. So it's really important to be able to increase women's, spending and the tools that they need to do that. So digitalization of, benefits only works if you have a bank account to transfer it to, right? Or if you have digital wallets, in some cases have actually helped people in some countries replace a bank account. And so if that is the approach that's being used, then I'm all for it, because it'll only increase women's economic independence. But I'm not 100% sure if that is inherent in the question, if that's the approach being used. But yeah, just for women to be able to use those types of systems it's important. And if that's the direction where we're moving, then those who are paying them in cash will also have to eventually move that direction too.
Yeah, thank you. We spoke indeed about the protesting mind, and someone asked, what does it take to have a protesting mindset and fight for your rights?
What it takes is knowing, on the one hand, so for example, in one of my classes on political development. It's one of the first things I do is make them read the Constitution in terms of the section on the fundamental rights, and also being able to that Aruba is bound by that, establish basic rights. So first of all, you need to be aware of what rights you're going to need to fight for, and that's not widely known. Second of all, you need to be mad. I'm sorry to say it, but you have to be moved to act. If you're not mad about it, you're not going to do more than put a little mad face on your, Facebook, beyond very passive, forms of disapproval, and get them to actually stand up and say, wait a minute, there's something wrong with this. And I think that, for example, because I was also at the Black Lives Matter community discussion, which I didn't include because it wasn't a protest per se, but in the Child Lives Matter protest and in the Black Lives Matter community discussion, people were moved by horrible things that happened. In Aruba with the child, seeing that children, men who had raped their very, very young children and only got a few years in prison had, basically gotten away with almost murder. And the many terrible cases that have happened in Aruba has moved people to say, this is what? We need to wake people up. We need to take a stand. It's frustration and anger is a strong moving force as well. And also with the George Floyd murder, it rallied people around the world because of the sheer injustice of it. And it was basically watching a snuff film that people, don't get a chance to see. It's it was just shocking at that level, right? It was like a state-sanctioned snuff film. It was the state doing this to somebody and watching it slowly. Oh my God. It was, because it's not the first killing. There've been many, many murders around in the States. But to see it in that way was more shocking for people. And it also wakes people up to the fact it's not just out there, it's here too. And so it's important to have in the one situations like that. And it's not that there's a lack of it in Aruba. There are women who are profoundly mistreated, and Fundación Gente Mujer has done a great job of trying to publicize that, doing videos, etc. But there hasn't been one horrible, terrible thing that has really rallied people around the fact that, oh my God, gender violence, because it's they don't necessarily see it as one big problem.
Yeah, that's true. And I think we have one last question, because those were so many questions. So how do you reach the group that doesn't care about gender inequality? Yeah, we tried with this, but can you give us tips on how to reach that group?
Yeah, for the group that don't care, you're never going to reach them all. You're never going to get everyone who doesn't care to care. But you can sway some people, right? And I think that, like I mentioned, with trying to reach them through popular media, through changing people's mindsets, through actually sitting down and taking a stand and saying, wait a minute, I don't like your joke, sorry, but that's really sexist, and calling an ace for what it is. People don't do that. There's this culture of politeness, and people don't want to challenge things or make people feel bad. Well, you have to, take a stand, and not just standing and walking in a protest, but doing it on a daily basis. Yep. Calling out daily discrimination is really the only way to put an end to it, right? And so that involves, acknowledging it, even acknowledging it if you do it yourself, because sometimes we are involved in it. And so it's important to call attention to it on an individual basis, use media wherever possible with things like I've said, with PSAs. Facebook in Aruba is it seems like the main thing. I think more people use Facebook than the internet in general, right? So having, for example, targeted advertising, or in a lot of the fake news discussions online, you can target sexist memes by the opposite, showing what it is. There are a lot of memes that have been put out exactly about, the kinds of inequalities women face. So like say the woman who is going to run a race against a man and she's like got all these obstacles in front of her on the racetrack, which, you know, those types of things where you try to raise more awareness.
Yeah, and I think you have to challenge people, their status quo, so their way of thinking, indeed, by presenting an opposite scenario, as you said, you know, so instead of looking at from one way, looking at the other. Now, Jen, I think we've come to the end of another Zoom presentation, and yours was very interesting. And I think and I hope that we will look at gender inequality in a different way, but also start those conversations at home amongst friends and families, and try not to get caught up indeed with the stereotypes that we're used to, especially as you've said in the Caribbean, here in Aruba, objectifying women. But let's start looking and changing the way things are going. And COVID-19 brought this all into being. So thank you very much for your time and for your presentation. I would like to thank all others who have, you know, registered for this Zoom presentation, who have looked at us through this hour, because it was really a very interesting hour. And as you know, this recording will be made available at a later date. Next week, we will have another interesting topic on the Aruba Post Corona, a new normal, and we'll be looking at governance. So I do encourage you to visit our website, www.uaaw. Go to the tab Lifelong Learning, and there you'll see all our upcoming events and this Zoom webinar. And if you're not a member of our mailing list, please send an email to cll@ua.aw. I wish you a pleasant afternoon and looking forward to seeing you again. Thank you very much.
Bye. Thanks for tuning in, everyone.
Thanks.